Hello and welcome to the Living on the Edge Forum. My name's Tanya Ha. I'm a science journalist and a sustainability researcher, and I'm pleased to be your host for today's forum. The Living on the Edge Forum is part of a suite of forums that are being held as part of the Bushfire CRC Research to Drive Change project. Now, a brief overview of today's forum. Today, the focus is on understanding the benefits and risks of living in potentially fire-prone areas at the rural-urban interface. We'll soon start with an introductory video, followed by 2 research presentations and a discussion with a lead end user. Along the way, there'll be online polls and opportunities for discussion. Now, for those of you who are new to this online platform, I'll quickly introduce you to this online environment. The main parts are self-explanatory. The presenter slideshows are in the middle panel, and to the right of the screen, you'll see the presenters appearing, like myself, via webcam. But importantly, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there's a list of the people who are online today, and at the bottom left of the screen, you'll see a dialogue box. It has a small talking balloon out of the top of it, and this is the place that you can type in your comments and questions as today's proceedings continue. So we really do want you involved in today's discussion. Now, one thing to note is that our voices are coming via phone lines, while the vision is coming via the internet. And in some cases, this does mean that they're slightly out of sync. Do bear with us. We make this choice to have the optimum bandwidth so that people can see and hear us clearly without requiring the world's best internet connection. The forum will be recorded today and will be available on the Bushfire CRC website in a few days' time. So if you have colleagues that might be interested in the research you hear about today, do let them know that they can look at it at a later date. Also, our last Research to Drive Change forum on effective communication and engagement is also now online. Thanks to those who've already sent through questions. We'll do our best to get through those questions during today's proceedings, and do feel free to send in more questions. Okay, to kick off today's proceedings with a bit of interactivity, we're going to, actually I'll first introduce who you're going to hear from today. Today, the researchers we'll be hearing from are Professor Ruth Berlin from the University of Wollongong. We'll also hear from Associate Professor Ruth Berlin from the University of Melbourne. And the lead end user we'll hear from is Mike Walters. He's at the Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources in South Australia. But more from them later. Now, we're going to start, as I mentioned, with a poll to be a bit interactive. We just want to see how much you feel you know about today's topic. Tell us, how much do you think you understand about the ways communities in rural and urban interface areas perceive and respond to bushfire risk? So click on 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 for the appropriate answer. And we'll give a few seconds more. And we'll leave it there. That's actually quite an interesting response. You know, we find with other presentations, the bell curve tends to skew towards the end of not knowing as much, but it sounds like the audience is fairly confident in their knowledge of this area. We'll see what we can learn through today's presentations. But before we kick off, we're going to hear a video. This is produced by the Bushfire CRC, and it will tell us a little bit about the research that's being presented today, as well as introducing the people we'll be hearing from.
Fire management is not a physical problem in terms of the risk is actually to people and to society and assets. Yes, it's got physical elements in terms of fire behaviour and fuel and buildings, but in reality to solve any problems or to reduce risk, it's actually where social science and the physical and natural sciences intersect.
We're in a rapidly developing field of examining, in the aftermath of major disasters, the environmental factors that contributed to destruction. It's often assumed that things like people's aesthetic preferences, their attitudes to the value of bushland as habitat and ecological values, etc., are somehow fundamentally at odds and lead them to exist in a high-risk state. That those values that underpin amenity are somehow preventing people from taking action. In fact, what we found was that people prefer bushland around their property in a condition which is relatively low fuel, which is quite open, and which actually corresponds or translates into also preferred states for recreation and aesthetics. So fundamentally, there's not evidence of a really strong conflict between the state of fuel, which is what we call typically fuel hazard, which is a key element of the risk, and their preferred condition of the vegetation in terms of their amenity.
It should actually give us better, more tailored outcomes if we can work either with supporting community values or directly with the community in trying to design bushfire management measures that are both more acceptable to the community and also protect the values that they actually value rather than what we think they value. So it should give us better outcomes in the longer run, even though it may be more complicated getting there.
Basically all the houses are gone. It's just terrible. And then the 2 primary schools have gone in town. As I said, the restaurant, the hardware store, 2 restaurants. And yeah.
One of the things that we do, especially because we live in largely urban environments, is we reinforce that divide between nature and culture, and we think about controlling or commanding nature to give us some way of inhabiting the spaces that are important to us. Because our interest in this research group is in landscape, we were interested in thinking about how that social and ecological world came together for people, because it seems like in the government end, they're aware that there's this social aspect to living in the landscape. That's the conundrum, but the mitigation that they enact is usually all around managing the ecology or managing the nature part of it. And we wanted to bring that nature, color, and culture bit together and thought about how to develop a method that actually physically did that during the interview process. So what we got them to describe is what they did in a week in that landscape. So, where do you go? How do you do it? Why do you do it? Where do you go for a walk? What do you do? How do you look after those cows? What did you do? How do the kids go to school? And then introduce the element of risk into that. So, how does this work when there's a fire? Or what do you think about this in relation to fire? So in that way, they established how they live in the landscape first, and they vocalized it, which is something people don't do all the time. Once they have their regional map on the thing, they're talking about it as a landscape, that they understand that they're not living in isolation. And that's something really interesting, because most messages are just targeted at the householder.
Fire suppression is possibly close to its limits. We don't have a lot more resource to throw at it. Technology will make improvements, but some of those landscapes, there will be fires in the future. We can't stop them. As we engage with the community on different issues, here's some tools that will help facilitate better conversations. And largely that's what's happening, is we need to have stronger conversations with the community to find the win-wins.
Thank you to the Bushfire CS for that video. Now, I've gathered from the dialogue box that some people have had trouble viewing that video. It is available online via the Bushfire CRC website, so you can have a look at that after today's forum. But for those people who missed its content, in summary, it was looking at the relationship between humans and the landscape that they live in, particularly at the urban-rural interface, and how our ideas and our understandings of those landscapes are not just ecological or physical, they're also social and cultural. And this has bearings on our perception of risks, on our preparation in bushfire seasons and so on. But now we're going to hear more from the researchers themselves. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first researcher. We have with us Professor Ross Bradstock from the University of Wollongong, and he'll now present on the social construct of fuels in the interface. Thank you, Ross.
Thank you, Tanya. And before I launch into this presentation, I want to emphasise that our project was a team effort and involved a whole heap of people. And I will read their names out. Nick Gill, Christine Erickson, Chris Brennan-Hawley, Olivia Dunn, Sandra Penman, Owen Price, Trent Penman, and Carrie Wilkinson. And so the work I will present is their work. Okay, let's launch into it. Here we have a house, and it's sitting in an environment which was recently burnt in a major fire. Something's going on there. They've got the house up for sale after the event. So you can ask, why did this house survive this fire? There's obviously been a high-intensity fire in the landscape. What contributed to the fact that it survived, whereas houses down the road did not survive, they were lost? How did factors in the landscape, vegetation, etc., the nature, in particular of vegetation around that house, contribute to its survival? Pretty relevant question. With regard to the fact that these people are now pulling out, what's changed? Was it the experience of this fire? Is it something to do with changes in the vegetation, the surrounding environment, that has made up the minds of these people to get out? How do these people perceive their surrounding environment? In particular, how do they value that environment in terms of their amenity? Things like aesthetics, recreation, etc. And has that influenced their decisions? These are all obviously also relevant questions. We are seeing legislative action or legislative instruments being implemented whereby people can manipulate fuels in particular around their property, literally in their backyards. For example, in New South Wales, there's new 1050 legislation which governs clearance of trees and the shrub layer on people's properties, allowing people scope for action. And how does this intersect with what we call amenity, the way people value and use the environments around their property? Is there a mandated happy coincidence in this regard between risk mitigation, hazard reduction, and amenity? These are sort of central questions to the study we conducted. Our study focuses in particular on sort of the backyards and the stuff over the back fence of properties in a number of communities in New South Wales and the ACT. And in particular, our study has three themes, the first of which is a risk analysis, whereby we looked at actual data on properties that survived and properties that didn't survive major fires in New South Wales from the period 2001 to 2010. And in particular, we're interested in environmental features, condition of vegetation, some stuff that's hardwired into the landscape, such as topography, as well as other factors such as house density, distance to water bodies, etc. More or less asking what really matters at or near the interface in terms of actual risk of loss, retrospective analysis of risk of loss over the last decade in New South Wales. We also conducted essentially a second thematic study, which was about understanding amenity in various communities, which more or less confronts the question of what is important to residents at and near the interface, particularly in terms of environmental attributes and vegetation, etc. What are the things that they use, they value, they enjoy? And I would emphasise this has been done through on-ground survey work of various kinds, which I'll explain in a second. The third theme of the work was essentially an integration of these two perspectives. On the one hand, a statistical analysis of the factors governing risk of loss versus an analysis of what we learned about amenity through intensive survey. And we posed the question, are these two things complementary or fundamentally in conflict? Okay, just to expand a little bit in terms of the methodologies. In theme 1, we looked at the factors in and around houses that determine the chance of loss once a fire has arrived, and I'll reiterate that we looked at major fires over the last decade or so in New South Wales in this instance. And it's, again, a statistical modelling approach. Theme 2 revolved around surveys of amenity, and in particular I'm going to just very briefly run through a photo elicitation exercise that was conducted as part of a wider, a more general set of surveys. And the photo elicitation exercise was an attempt to understand residents' the preferences of residents for fuel hazard, aesthetics and recreation. And this was done in 3 communities in the Blue Mountains, Mount Wilson, Bilpin and Darwin Mountain, and the Womboyne, Bungendore, Bywong communities down around the eastern fringe of the ACT. Now, the photo elicitation exercise was part of a much wider set of detailed surveys. I'm not going to go into the results of that wider set of data. And we're just going to focus on the photo elicitation part of it in this presentation. So as part of the photo elicitation, people were shown scenes like this, which more or less reflect a spectrum of condition of vegetation ranging from highly open, cleared scenes through to scenes with very dense understory, etc., and gradations in between. The third theme, it was essentially about revisiting these communities following the elicitation of preferences and using the risk model involved in theme 1 to actually derive an estimate of risk based on the characteristics of those communities at the moment. So in other words, after we figured out what people's preferences were, we then went back and had a look at the actual risk status using the risk model which we produced. This is one way of addressing the fundamental question whether there is a conflict between hazard and risk reduction and amenity. Okay, so some results. First of all, for the analysis of the retrospective analysis of risk of loss. We found 2 important determinants of loss to do with essentially garden type or garden cover and forest cover. Both exhibit a positive relationship between essentially plant cover, whether it be gardens and forest cover, and probability of loss of property. You can see that essentially the effect is subtle and modest. It's not spectacular, but nonetheless there is a positive relationship between the condition or the cover of vegetation and loss. We also found other effects an interesting interaction between house density and slope. In other words, when houses are more closely spaced, there is a higher risk of loss, and an effect of distance to water bodies. If there is water around, there was a lower risk of loss. These results more or less back up or are consistent with results from other published studies, particularly after the 2009 fires in Victoria, regarding the effects of garden cover and distance or forest cover. So it's confirming the importance of vegetation condition around properties as a determinant of loss. The results for theme 2, the elicitation of preferences, were interesting. First of all, in terms of fuel hazard, people expressed in both sets of communities a strong preference for scenes with relatively low hazard. So that's the sort of pictures in the top left-hand corner there. There's a very strong and clear preference in the samples. With regard to the two measures of amenity, either aesthetics or recreational preferences, there was a much greater spread of preferences, expressed preferences, as you can see from the histograms here. There's some hint of bimodality in the response. In other words, people either in the camp of open vegetation or amenity or relatively dense vegetation. There is no statistical relationship between their preferences for hazard and preferences for amenity, but there is a statistical relationship between aesthetic and recreational preferences. There's no, I should say, there's no major difference between the communities in that regard in terms of amenity preferences either. The results for theme 3, the integration, are rather interesting. When we put it all together, we can produce a risk estimate for the 4 communities, which is shown here. You'll see that the probability of loss, generally speaking across the board, is relatively high. Now, this estimation of the probability of loss is conditional. It assumes a fire has arrived at the community, so it does not incorporate the chance of a fire arriving, in other words, what we call likelihood. Nonetheless, you can see that risk in this sense, in this conditional sense, is relatively high, and one of the communities in particular, Bowen Mountain, stands out as having somewhat higher risk than the others. Now, there are 2 reasons essentially for these patterns. First of all, the overall relatively high level of risk is essentially due to relatively high fuel hazard levels across the board. And the outstanding result of Bowen Mountain, in other words, a higher risk relative to the other communities, is partially driven by a higher density of property. So all those factors were important in the risk model. Okay, so we can sort of sum up these results in the following manner. First of all, gardens, garden cover, setbacks from the forest edge, forest cover in the immediate vicinity of property is really important in terms of governing risk of loss if a major fire arrives. And as I indicated, this is an emerging model that essentially builds on studies of losses elsewhere, Victoria 2009, also overseas work from places like California. This means that manipulation of fuel via the way that you lay out your garden, the stuff you plant in it, and the way you might manage bushland in and around your property is pretty important. Second point is rather interesting. People can identify fuel hazard quite well. The photo elicitation exercise demonstrated that. Additionally, the photo elicitation exercise indicated, at least in the communities that we surveyed, that people preferred relatively low fuel hazard at the wildland-urban interface. Thirdly, we could not find strong evidence of fundamental conflicts between amenity preferences as determined in the photo elicitation exercise in these communities dealing with aesthetics and recreation. These things were not fundamentally in conflict with preferences for fuel hazard. Okay, so given all that, the fourth finding is rather interesting. These particular communities are at the moment coexisting with relatively high hazard and risk, which sort of jars against the preceding findings. In particular, people said they preferred low hazard, but when we actually examined the state of fuel hazard and corresponding risk that emerges from that, they're more or less sitting in a high risk situation. So why is this so? We suggest that there's a number of candidate reasons. The first one might be simply lack of resources to do something about it. If they actually prefer low hazard close in to their properties, they may not have the capacity in terms of time and money to do stuff to mitigate fuel hazard. There may be other priorities in people's lives, therefore they may perceive high hazard, but they may not be acting upon it because there's all sorts of other stuff that people have got going on, and it may not be foremost in their mind all the time. Related to that is the possibility that people are essentially underestimating likelihood. In other words, people may have a tendency to think, well, it's not going to happen here. And then to some degree, there may be conscious or subconscious trade-offs between hazard and risk in this sense. People are trading off, likelihood and hazard. In other words, I'll carry a bit more hazard around my place because I just don't think there's much chance of a fire reaching here. I would stress that these are all hypotheses, possible explanations as to why these communities are existing in a relatively high hazard and risk state at the moment. They need further investigation. Okay, so I'll leave it there and pass over to Ruth.
Great. Thank you, Ross. We are having some questions come through, so we'll cut straight to those.
Okay.
Kathy asked, what vegetation did well? Did you look at natives, for example, versus European vegetation? Was that part of any of the research?
Yeah, I'm assuming that what she means by doing well means in terms of risk analysis. The discrimination between gardens and forest cover is a dichotomy to some degree between exotics and natives. Though some people, of course, have natives in their gardens. We couldn't. Our analysis of house loss over the last 10 years is a retrospective exercise where a lot of the information is gleaned from aerial photography. And so we can't necessarily scrutinise whether a garden is composed entirely of natives or exotics. But the effect of gardens on risk of loss to some degree must include an exotic component in it. Obviously, the effect of increasing forest cover on increasing risk of loss is primarily a native species effect. So I hope that gives some insight into or some answer into that question.
Yeah. Cormac sent through a question as well, and it was when you were speaking about the third research outcome about amenity preferences. He asked, could this be a case of revealed preferences?
Well, they certainly were revealed. They were revealed in direct face-to-face interviews. So, yeah, look, I mean, whether people are subconsciously hiding other things or they're, you know, trying to give the answer they expect the interviewer wants to hear, I don't know. We're assuming that they reflect reality and that they are responses that are dear to the hearts of the respondents. But someone who knows human behaviour better than I might be able to add insight into that question.
Sanara sent in a question earlier. Are we creating a culture where removing trees is seen as the desired and good, she put in quote marks, behaviour that self-perpetuates? How do we reduce risk while minimising cultural harm?
Well, the first thing to say is some removal, not, you know, total removal, may be good in terms of mitigation of risk, and there are also spatial constraints around that as well. So it's a subtle, you know, there are subtle effects there that you have to be careful of, but some removal of trees may be beneficial in terms of risk reduction. However, the assumption that this is somehow necessarily in conflict with at least some of the values of residents is not borne out by our study, at least in the communities that we surveyed, if you can believe the stated preferences of the respondents. Now, we, you know, I'd qualify that by saying we looked at two components of amenity in the elicitation exercise, which is athletics and recreational preferences. There are, of course, other components of amenity, and some of the interview work, the more detailed interview work and place mapping that went on in our study, you know, revealed other layers, but at least at the level we've looked at. Can't necessarily say there's a fundamental conflict.
Yeah. We've probably got time for the two questions that have been posted. If they're fairly quick answers, Ross, because we are a bit short on time. First off, Jeff has asked, did you look at differences of risk acceptance based on the fire danger rating or fire danger index? For example, low fire risk days versus extreme days?
No.
Oh, that was an easy answer, wasn't it? So
I'll just very briefly expand on that to say retrospective analysis of house losses has been done for Victoria 2009 in published studies. So that represents, you know, an examination of the factors determining house loss under the most extreme conditions. The studies that we did of New South Wales data represent somewhat milder conditions. There is alignment of some of the determinants, particularly in terms of vegetation coverage from those types of studies.
Yeah. So. Thanks. And finally, Trevor has asked, are people underestimating probability or being realistic about it?
That's a very good question. We suspect the former rather than the latter. But, yeah, that needs to be looked at more carefully.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there, Ross. Thank you for your answers and for your presentation. It's a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. We're now going to hear from Associate Professor Ruth Berlin, and together with Karen Reid at the University of Melbourne, she also researches the social construct of fuels at the interface. Take it away, Ruth.
Thanks very much, Tanya. I want to introduce this project by saying that it actually was a part of the same research group as the project that Ross was involved in. However, this one was at a pilot study because it was only 2 years and it was very concentrated around finding ways to improve engagement with communities to understand from a social perspective how to deal with some of the issues that Ross has raised in the previous discussion. So it was a 2-year pilot study. There were 2 sites, the peri-urban Adelaide Hills and rural Victoria. And the initial question that people might ask is, what is the social construction of something? And it's the idea that there are multiple worldviews out there and that people are understanding the risk of fire or the meaning of fuel as something quite different from each other. The fire agencies gave us the question, what assets do residents of regional, rural, and peri-urban landscapes want to protect? Because they had the sense that it was more than the home, or it was more than the house and the fences. And there was also the question that there seems to be a lot of information out there, and people can get hold of information about what to do for preparation and so on. So why is it there's a gap between, or an apparent gap between, what people do or how they're responding to the risk of fire and what they're told, what information they have? And what methods can we use to better understand the social issues that are important to residents? So this question really went to how agencies and community groups could deal with understanding what was important in their local area. So I wanted just to preface this by saying, as I think would have come through in the video, that nature is not outside of culture in the way we understand it. And so we think about the way we describe our landscapes and live in them. If you look at this image of housing in Canberra, you can see that people are planting trees in all the streetscapes. They live with the forest coming quite close to their residential housing. They live in valleys that are surrounded by forests. And so we're really talking about people and the ecological system. And therefore, you can't really separate them when you're doing your analysis of what's going on. So here, in a picture from rural Victoria, we're talking about landscape, we're defining landscape. And we're saying here that it encompasses the physical realities that Ross was mentioning, as well as the understanding that there's all these kinds of things that go on in your imagination and the social processes of how you interpret what these landscapes are that are important to put into context when we're talking about something like risk. Because, for example, there's a difference between risk and hazard, as our lead end user, Mike Wooders, described earlier, that somebody might not see a productive agricultural field as a hazard unless there's a shortage of rain, and then it becomes risky in a different sense. The other thing that we're really conscious of is that the socio and ecological combination allowed us to ask people what their landscape actually comprised. Is it, as a local, is just their garden and their house? Was it the street that they lived on? Was it the wider landscape that they traversed each day? How did they actually limit the area that they considered to be important when trying to manage or prepare for fire? So the experience of fire in the peri-urban might be thought to be very different from that of living in a rural landscape, but many of the responses were very similar. So we began by asking residents, what assets do you value? What sorts of things are important to you? And one of the things that we thought people would say would be, of course, their houses and so on. But what we very quickly saw was this integration of ecological purpose. And this, I think, picks up on Ross's earlier point about what do people really value. An interesting thing here is that what we did find, whether people choose to live in these regions or these areas for socioeconomic reasons or other, that the house and the fence line and so on were not really the end of their landscape. In many responses, people talked about their gardens, the places that they walked, the koalas in the trees, the red gums which they camped under during the summer. And what emerged very clearly is this idea that biodiversity and assets are not so separate from each other. And so you get an image like this, not dissimilar, I would say, to one of the images in Ross's photo elicitation, but where nobody described this as fuel in any of the 40-plus interviews. Not fuel, but a much-loved place. So this idea, again, that risk and hazard are not connected is pretty important. Ideas of place, however, are really important to the study that we did. So the way that people actually imagine where they're living and what's important to them. So it's more than an appearance, it's what you actually do in these landscapes and how you experience them. As I said in the opening, one of the critical things for us was actually trying to find methods that help people to address the idea that the social and the ecological need to be understood together or to be addressed together. And so we thought that one of the ways of doing this was to get them to actually describe what they do in these landscapes. This is an image from King Lake in 2009. And you can see that it's an even-age stand that burned, so it's probably about 30 years since the last fire. And yet people were living right alongside this area, rebuilding new houses, of course, in the period between the previous fire and 2009. And so we wondered how they actually read the landscape, what they actually know about it, and then we incorporated that idea into the questions we asked. And we developed what we call a narrative mapping technique. This isn't a new technique, I hasten to add. It's building on experiences that others have had with the use of maps in fire risk research. The central point that we started with was that all the lead-end agencies tend to use maps to define areas and to organize responses. And so we tried giving respondents to this study the same kind of maps to use, but they seem to have a lot of difficulty reading them. Often in rural areas, they actually described how the map didn't actually represent what was in the real landscape. But also they had trouble locating themselves in these landscapes and were in the map landscape and were distracted from actually thinking about the questions. So we ended up with a really highly scientific tool, butcher paper, and magic markers. And we gave people the chance to draw their landscapes of importance. So we asked them, where do you go in a week? Where do you consider the landscape ends for you? What is the area that you're concerned with? And they used the maps as a kind of memory aid to talk about their experience of living there and with fire. So it was really interesting to us because we were talking to them in the interview process, but they were busy talking to us about the things they were drawing on the map. So you can see the red arrows here on the top left are an indication of where the fire usually comes from. But in the course of the discussion, they talked about the fire that came from the side, from the bottom on the map, and the one that they weren't expecting, and then the consequences of that to their land management. So the maps actually helped us to negotiate an understanding of how they see the spaces, what was important to them in the landscape, and it actually helped them to engage with the issues of risk. One of the things that came out of our study that was particularly interesting to us was this idea of social memory. So people help you to remember things by telling you stories, and then you recount those stories to other people, and in that process, you order the story, you make up the narrative, you tell the story so that it has meaning, so that you have some kind of plot going on. And we acquire new memories in the different social environments in which we live, and we share those with other people, like your fire group, for example. And so those communities of thought actually help you to establish what you think you know about fire. And that builds a kind of memory about what you think you should be doing in response to fire threat. And so we remember things sometimes that we've never experienced, but that somebody else has told the story about, and that becomes part of our collective narrative or an individual narrative. And there's actually some physical proof about this particular idea as well. The idea that we have this sort of flexible construct available in our minds where we're able to delete the things that we didn't like so much and keep the ones we like, or insert some new ones, and they become part of our physical memory or our imagined memory. So we can move back and forth between the past and the present, constructing likely scenarios. And we can use these scenarios to figure out likely future outcomes. So I think, this is something we can probably use effectively to help people to understand fire risk, for example. One of the really interesting things was that, as Ross has pointed out, people sometimes respond with the idea, well, it isn't likely to happen here, therefore I don't really have to do it. But what we find out is that they may be, even when it's true that it may happen here, for example, the fire might come from a different direction, they may block that out until actually confronted with it, because it's not a positive memory that they want to hang on to. So we asked the question, how is it that people maintain such a rosy bias, even when information is not so good? And the answer is that it seems that people have the capacity for memory to be a forward construction. So it's not necessarily based on their experience of the past. So there are 4 research outcomes that we were able to take from this research. The first was that the assets extended out from the actual physical features of the house that you might have expected, like the house and the fence, and into the wider landscape around them. So home was something that people described as including the wider landscape that they encompass, for example, where they might have gone camping with the kids, or where the koalas were in the trees, or where they went to listen to certain birds, or just where they walked every week. And you can understand that that would have implications, as we note in 2, because people don't identify those places as necessarily being at risk. So the difference between hazard and risk, it's their place. And this has implications for their responses to things like clearing around their houses or prescribed burning, because those places are special to them and they want them to look like the landscape that they chose to live in or are part of. This is true too for farming communities, where they've been there. In the one that we interviewed in the area we were in, people had been there for 5 generations, so it had a look that they were pretty determined to maintain. There's also this recognition of socioecological landscapes in the narrative mapping technique that helped to actually get people to focus on the real territory of interest. So it would seem that messages that are targeted towards bigger than just your personal house might have more connection with people, because they're interested in their regional or bigger than private property landscape. And social memory emerged as a key factor in how people assemble their narratives, and that could be used at both a collective or individual level to help people to better absorb fire safety messages. Yeah. So that's it. Back to you, Tanya.
Thanks, Ruth. We'll kick off with a question that Leslie sent in. Has the research shown that continuing community engagement, or that with continuing community engagement, residents are more aware of their responsibilities to protect themselves and their homes in bushfire-prone areas?
I think the thing here is there's a lot of research to show that community engagement depends on having trust and credibility within the community group, like the community that organizes around these kinds of fire responses and the agencies that are involved. And so I think programs that can have a long-term project rather than just short-term kind of seasonal impact will probably be more successful. But we didn't actually investigate that particular thing, so I couldn't comment from just this research.
Yeah, understandable. Tim has also sent in a question. Were resident perceptions tested both prior to a bushfire and after? How did their values or their set of priorities to choose to live there change post-incident?
So in the Victorian regional case study, everybody in there had experienced bushfire. and we're actually doing a follow-up survey with them just at this very moment to see whether the methods we use, the socio-ecological mapping that they did with us in 2012 or 13, impacted the way that they prepared for or understood their landscape for the fires in 2014. So we'll get back to you on that one. In the peri-urban area, there was more mixed response to fire experience because many people move in and out of those areas at a different rate. So we didn't have that surety that they had experience.
So it's certainly the research continues in that area.
Yeah.
Paula has sent through a question. And she's asked, has Ruth's work been published yet? Is it forthcoming? Such a great presentation. And I've got a note from our moderators here. There's some on the Bushfire CRC website, but I'll let you speak to that yourself, Ruth, as well.
So the CRC has made the video, and we have quite a few papers coming out. 2 have already been accepted, one in the International Journal of Wildfire, and the other one in Geoforum, the Geoforum one on the extension of home into the landscape, and the Journal of Wildfire on the assets paper. So there's 2 coming out on that, and there's a 3rd one in the pipeline on the role of social memory.
That's good to hear. And look, I believe it's a subject of one of the fire notes as well. So again, Paula, do have a look on the Bushfire CRC website at the end of the presentation today, and you'll find some research on the subject there. Monica has also sent through a question. I really like the idea of narrative mapping. This would be an interesting exercise for everyone to do about their home. Do you have a comment to make on that idea, Ruth?
So we've done the narrative mapping both in work. Tanya Kruger is doing her PhD as a Bushfire CRC funded project, and she's worked with local community fire brigades, and they've used the same technique in their interviews with her. So that was done in group, and we've done a couple of training sessions with lead end users and with interested fire bodies, the fire authorities, on how they could incorporate this into the projects they already have underway as community engagement.
Good to hear. Look, I think that's all we've got time for with questions. Thank you for your presentation and your answers, Ruth. Before we're going to hear from our lead end user, we're now going to do another online poll just to get a sense of how people intend to use the things that they've learnt today. Now, in this poll, you can answer more than one answer. So we're asking, in which ways could you begin to use what you've heard today? Could you, 1, share and discuss this with colleagues and stakeholders? 2, use findings to inform policy and practice in my organisation? 3, advocate for more resources for my organisation? Or 4, learn more about how I can apply this work to my role? And we're just asking you to give us your sense of how you value that. We're not asking you to make permanent commitments, but this is more to get a sense of what you find useful from the research you've heard today. And we'll have a few more seconds. And we'll leave it there, and thank you for your participation there. It's good to see that mix of both internal use within organisations and the external use as well, that this isn't just about what organisations are doing themselves, but a collaborative approach to bushfire management, which is great to hear. We'll now hear from our final presenter. We're now going to hear from Mike Wouters. He's a lead end user at the Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources in South Australia. Mike, just to kick off, tell us a little bit about your role and your thoughts regarding that poll result. Does that reflect what you value or how you use the research? Now, Mike, I'll interrupt there. I believe your phone is muted.
How about that?
Ah, yes, back again. We'll get you to repeat that, Mike. Apologies to the audience. Technical glitch. But Mike, can I just get you to start from that again?
I was just reiterating that the point you made about internal and external engagement is really important. A lot of our work is focused on to community and to stakeholders, but we need to spread the message within agencies as well, so that staff can understand about this research and some of the tools and messages that are coming from it. So I think it's really good that both those sides came in.
That's good. And what do you think the benefits are for the industry from this research, from your perspective?
It certainly highlights the fact that fire management is not just a physical or a biological process, that we have ignored the social aspects of it, and it certainly highlights that how people's perceptions are just as important as sometimes the physical hazards. Some of the fire management.
And what changes do you think need to occur within the fire and emergency management sector to take up the findings into policy and practice?
I think the outcomes from both of these projects are pushing us to do more engagement, which most agencies now are trying to push more engagement, moving away, not away from, but our education programs are really good, but for some communities we actually need to get a bit more hands-on, and particularly where Ross's project is suggesting there's some communities who understand the messages, but there's other reasons why they don't want to act or can't act, and we need to further understand that and possibly even try and help them if that's an issue. And then Ruth's mud mapping method is something that we can directly integrate into some of our engagement programs to try and get a better detail of what people understand and what their gaps are.
Yes. Michelle has sent in a question. What does assisting them to take action mean, and what assistance is being offered, and who has the capacity or the funding for this kind of work?
Assistance could mean anything from providing detailed advice. In many cases, some of the landholders just simply don't understand how to do what we're asking. If at the other end of the spectrum it might be about a large area of prescribed burning, well, many landholders don't have the resources to do that, yet fire and land management agencies do. And if that's a really high risk area, we need to think about whether that's something we need to do with them to try and reduce the overall risk. So it could be many things, and yes, resources are always a problem. We just need to try and do the best we can with the resources we've got.
Actually, Cormac has sent in a question it's a little bit related. What are the barriers to rolling out bushfire hazard maps to communities as a whole?
Most agencies and states have hazard maps available on their website. Again, that's another issue of, well, they're there and some people will see them and can use them, but part of that is they're now being used in some of the engagement programs where we actually point to people and say, here's the hazard in your location. Let's sit down and discuss what you could do around your property to try and manage that along with all the other issues you need to think about.
Nathan has also asked about place mapping. What steps can agencies take to implement place mapping into their community engagement practices?
As Ruth suggested, there's been a few training courses around, and I'm sure others could be organised. The Bushfire CRC are producing basically a how to do it guide, which will be on the website, which should step people through the processes. It's not a very complicated thing. It's understanding how to start it and how to facilitate that conversation that you want to have engaging with. So I think there's some progress there towards already doing it. And I think Nathan's point is right. It's about building it into programs we already have. We're not necessarily asking for a whole new set of programs.
Yes, that's not reinventing the wheel, but
that's another tool.
Yeah. Excellent. One more question, our final one. This has been sent in from Kathy, and we've paraphrased it a little bit, Kathy. When residents do not have a fire plan, should we sit down with each family and help them do one?
Some people, that might be what's required. And obviously we'd have to focus that level of effort against the resources we have. But in some very high-risk areas, maybe that's what we need to do, and that's what each agency needs to look at, where the risks are and what resources they've got to do with. And some of it may be picking key members of the community who can feed that information back to the community. So it might be a train-the-trainer type exercise with community leaders.
So multiple levels of engagement.
One of the challenges, we don't have the resources to do everything we want, so we just need to do the best we can.
Yeah. Well, on that note, that's all we've got time for now. Thank you for your feedback, Mike, and we'll bring you back on screen a little bit later as we wrap up. But before we do our final poll, I just wanted to mention, partly in response to Paula's question and in general, on the Bushfire CRC, there are fire notes that are relevant to what we've heard about today. So Fire Note 121 by Ruth Berlin is, we all view our surroundings differently. So that's one to have a look at. Ross's research is in Fire Note 129, Life on the Edge and Living with Risk. So do have a look for those on the Bushfire CRC website. Now we're going to revisit our first poll to see what people have learned during today's presentation or how they feel they're going with knowledge. So let us know how you think you understand the ways communities in rural and urban interface areas perceive and respond to bushfire risk. And we'll leave that there. Looks a little bit more towards the bottom of the screen, which we like to think means that you've learnt more, so we're always delighted to see that. I'll now bring our three presenters back to the screen. So in concluding today, I wanted to give the last word to you guys. Do you have a final thought to leave with the audience before we wind up today's proceedings? A take-home message, so to speak, starting with you, Ross.
I'll reiterate one of the key messages about risk. You can do a lot to mitigate risk literally in and around your own backyard. This study and others through retrospective analysis of loss of property shows that.
And Ruth?
So I guess I think this is about a broader civic discourse about how people will live in the future in the places that are being designated as likely places to live, and how we can support people who live in these areas to better understand the landscapes that they reside in. So I think it's part of a much more complex, as of course a social scientist would, discussion, and I hope that there is funding for that kind of research in the future.
True. And Mike?
I'd just like to thank the researchers for their work and encourage agencies to look at the resources on the website and attempt to implement it and use it.
We've had one final question sneak in on screen in the dialogue box. So Peter, we'll answer your one if anyone wants to put their hand up to respond to that. Based on your research outcomes, where could you find the common minimal denominator for fire agencies, government authorities to implement anything that all these individual interests can support? Is there a common denominator at all?
I guess I would say that the common denominator is the landscape in which you live, right? You choose to live in a place, or you end up living in a place, and it's really important to understand both the social and ecological systems in which you live, and not see yourself as outside of those.
The common denominator is the residents who are exposed to the problem. It's their well-being. It's their attitudes, and it's the motivation of those people that will, contribute to better management of the problem in the future.
And anything to add, Mike?
No, I'd only agree that I don't think there is a common denominator that will apply everywhere across Australia. We need to look at the landscapes and communities and what their needs are.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you to Ross, Ruth and Mike for being our presenters today, and thank you of course to you, the audience, for sending in your feedback and also your questions and being part of today's discussion. That brings today's forum to a close. We do encourage you to visit the website at bushfirecrc.com, where in the coming days we'll have today's presentation available to be viewed online, and do let any of your colleagues know who might benefit from listening to today's proceedings. And also those related reports and fire notes that I mentioned earlier, they'll also be found on the website. Now, we also have a brief exit survey, so we'd really appreciate it if people could take the time to provide feedback so that we can improve future forums. And our next webinar will be on fire in the landscape, looking at the impacts of bushfires on ecosystems, soil carbon pools and carbon pools above the ground, and water quality, and that will take place on August the 29th. So keep an eye on the Bushfire CRC website for details, or you can leave a comment in the exit survey if you'd like to be included in the mailing list for future online forums. Now, on behalf of the Bushfire CRC Research to Drive Change project and its partners, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.